G'day ladies and gents, Cubic Meter here with Squibble, who recently made a video demonstrating a way to automatically get the player's view angle into a wind charge. This is a completely useless technology with absolutely no applications whatsoever. Isn't it, Squibble? Wait, what are you doing? I have a bad feeling about this. Ever since Mojang gave players the ability to play tennis with a gas fireball, it has been a well-established mechanic for similar projectiles like wind charges. This is great if you want to shoot harmless fart balls at people, but lo and behold that you don't even need the player to initiate this behavior. In fact, all you need is a projectile that belongs to the player to collide with the wind charge, and it will copy the player's view angle no matter where the player is. This has substantial ramifications for the trout population. For example, there's the trout population, and there's the ramifications. It turns out that the capability to get the player's view angle from a wind charge just might be the revolution for cannon tech that we need. But how do we unlock the potential of this technology in the form of a functioning redstone build? Well, you should probably start with my video on wind charges and understanding how they work, as this knowledge will be crucial to understanding the dynamics of our problem. Then we'll learn to harness those dynamics to produce the desired outcome, which is to transfer the player's view angle from the wind charge onto another projectile. Considering the wind charge moves in the direction the player is looking, an entity at the wind charge's initial position will get propelled in the opposite direction to where the player is looking. This works fine for a cannon if you're married to Courtney Love, but is otherwise not ideal. What we need to do is chain together a bunch of explosion interactions to refocus the knockback into the direction we want. However, if you were paying attention to that animation, you might have noticed an issue. Our input and output angles are not the same. This is a problem we will inevitably encounter, but we cannot begin to tackle it until we have a working proof of concept to verify our established dynamics. Here is a simple proof of concept for the aiming mechanism. These two dupers were taken from the Hypersonic Claymore project and wired to create 3 batches of TNT with various fuse times. The first batch slots into the lower position so that it can propel the next 2 batches straight upwards. If we tick forward a single step to when the TNT starts moving, it enters this chamber up here where the wind charge explodes, changing the relative alignments of the TNT to the direction that the player is aiming. The wind charge entity is created in between the 2 batches of TNT that get launched. So when the TNT starts moving, the first batch gets exposed to the wind charge, but any subsequent TNT entering the chamber arrives after the wind charge explosion, thus retaining its original momentum. A really neat trick that Squibble alluded to in his original video was the ability to align the wind charge such that part of its hitbox protrudes through a solid block like this pane of glass. This allows the wind charge to be interacted with through a wall. If I go ahead and pop an arrow in this bubble column down here, we can effectively reuse this arrow over and over again using this alignment of the wind charge to prevent the arrow from being affected by the wind charge's explosion. With the wind charge wired into the cannon to be created between our 2 TNT batches, we obtain a TNT cannon that aims roughly where the player is looking. And I say roughly because the angle seems to deviate from my view direction quite a lot. However, this is incredibly cool and definitely a step in the right direction. But now we need to address the issue of the wind charge and how to actually obtain a wind charge this precisely aligned using redstone that we can actually build. There are only 2 ways to obtain wind charges automatically. There is the breeze mob shooting at other mobs, as well as dispensers shooting out the wind charge item. These 2 different types of wind charges have very different explosion responses. This creates an array of benefits and trade-offs for using either one, which greatly complicates the decision making for our cannon designs. For example, this is a lossless breeze charge aligner. while this is a lossless wind charge aligner. Can you take a quick guess at which one is more difficult to build? The wind charge aligner is so much better for so many reasons. Firstly, we know exactly when the dispenser fires, so we can perfectly control when the wind charge is added to the entity list. On the other hand, the breeze mob will take a random amount of time from 0 to 30 ticks before it acquires a target, meaning we are basically forced to have the breeze charge created before the TNT. It makes sense for Squibble to use a breeze mob for his designs because his mirror receiver concept demands a constant supply of wind charges to function, and in this case, the fact that breeze mobs can produce wind charges for free indefinitely outweighs the cost of getting the breeze mob. But for our purposes, consuming a single wind charge item per shot as ammunition is a very small price to pay for a literal TNT cannon. To actually get the breeze charge into the correct alignment, we need to do a bit of faffing about. The problem is that wind charges have a very awkward hitbox which is exactly 0.3125 blocks wide. This is in contrast to other projectiles like arrows that have a hitbox of exactly 0.5 blocks wide. The significance of this is that while there are many hitboxes that allow you to perfectly align the arrow to the center of a block, there are literally no hitboxes that can get anywhere near that kind of alignment for a wind charge. This means the only realistic way to get a wind charge even remotely close to the center of a block is to actually allow the wind charge to start moving. To help us find such alignments, we can use a command block that prints out the position of the wind charge over time. We determine that the wind charge has an alignment very close to being in the exact center of a block at around 21 in the X direction. So that is actually this block right here. Swapping out our printing command block for a tick freeze. Getting closer. There we go. At this exact point, our wind charge is almost perfectly aligned to the center of a block in the X direction. Something that's important to note is that even though the wind charge is moving with some initial velocity, the moment it gets hit by the player's projectile, it will completely forget whatever motion it has and start moving in the new direction defined by the player's view angle. This means if we can simply align when the wind charge and the arrow meet such that the wind charge is at that perfect center of a block alignment when the arrow hits, that will be the origin for the wind charge with respect to the player's view angle. And with that, we have a fully functional prototype for our player aimable TNT cannon. An aimable TNT cannon is not our end goal here. In a previous video, we established that it is very difficult to kill a player using TNT. A player with full protection enchants can literally take an explosion to the face and just walk it off. What we want is a player aimable hypersonic arrow cannon. Because arrows scale their damage depending on their velocity, you can just spam TNT in the propulsion of the arrow until it can kill literally anything. I imagine we can take this proof of concept and turn it on its side, making an orbital weapons platform with a 360-degree field of fire. This new orientation presents us with a few challenges. For example, recovery of the arrow in our prototype is aided by gravity, allowing us to reuse the same arrow. However, in a 360 mirror chamber, we lose this symmetry from the orientation of our mechanisms. So if we cannot reuse the same arrow, the next best thing would be to stock up a magazine and consume an arrow with each shot. However, arrows are really annoying and don't behave predictably in horizontal flight. So I decided to get in touch with Nothing But Luck, a resident expert on pearl stasis and alignment systems who made this amazing snowball aligner. The idea is that we simply use the player throwing a snowball as the activation for the entire cannon, meaning we don't even have to worry about retrieving the projectile after every shot. Just like arrows, snowballs that belong to the player will also transfer the player's view angle. This makes the snowballs a perfect substitute for the arrows. The setup starts with a base plane which sets the stage for our aiming mechanism. A snowball starts the cannon and we use gravity to align the arrows. Then the wind charge floats into position using the water alignment trick, while the TNT is travelling at high speed to minimize the time between readout and execution of the target view angle. But there is a problem. The base plane must be a continuous solid for the wind charge to collide with, and a hole for the TNT to pass through and under a tick. To find a solution, we must refer to the game loop. Every tick, events in the game are processed in a specific order. For our problem, we are specifically interested in the tile event, block event, entity, and block entity phases. The mechanism involves placing and breaking a pumpkin by tricking a dispenser into thinking it's building a snow golem. And it all happens very quickly over the span of 3 ticks. The entities are always processed in the order of snowball, TNT, then wind charge. So in tick 1, the wind charge is moved into position. In tick 2, the dispenser places the pumpkin in the tile event phase. Then the snowball hits the wind charge, the TNT moves into range, and the wind charge explodes against the pumpkin. In tick 3, the piston breaks the pumpkin in the block event phase, which is just before the TNT starts moving again. And then the piston doesn't actually start to extend until the block entity phase, after the TNT has passed through the hole. This results in a mechanism which for all intents and purposes doesn't seem like it should work. But it works! With that problem solved, now we need to figure out how we can fine-tune the cannon so we can aim it properly. There are 3 input parameters that we can control: the position of the TNT, the position of the wind charge, and the position of the arrows. However, things are a bit tricky because realistically the TNT position affects where the TNT will be in the next tick, which also affects where the arrow needs to be. The position of the wind charge also affects the timing of the wind charge explosion, which means if the wind charge crosses one of these timing envelopes before striking the base plane, the timing of the wind charge explosion gets delayed and misses the TNT. It's also important to note that wind charges will always create the explosion exactly 0.25 blocks normal to the point that they impact. With all this in mind, let's build a model to visualize the dynamics of our mechanism. This model lets us move the TNT and the wind charge to visualize the displacement of the TNT. Ideally, the arrows will be positioned at the origin of the TNT displacement. We apply rules such as the maximum range of the explosion and the wind charge timing envelopes. If we want to ensure that the input and output angles are the same, we end up positioning the TNT exactly 0.25 blocks above the wind charge. Going outside the first envelope but maintaining the 0.25 offset, we do technically preserve the input angle, but we get other undesirable effects such as the TNT displacement changing dramatically with angle. So ideally we will keep the wind charge within 1 block of the base plane. Here is an exhaustive range of vertical alignments for wind charges that are feasible in the game. This should hopefully emphasize the challenges with using wind charges in cannon tech, as we have 26 different vertical alignments and absolutely none of them are 0.5 blocks exactly. We can plot these as contours and obtain an array of patterns showing us how the dynamics change as the wind charge moves further from the base plane. Most notably, the closer the wind charge and the TNT are to the base plane, the further the TNT will spread out from its origin. To understand how the displacement of the TNT affects our cannon, we need to figure out what to do with the arrows. To give our cannon some tolerance for inaccuracy, we will use a tight spread of arrows. However, the spread that you get straight out of a dispenser is too large and too clumsy for our needs. To reduce the spread, we can dispense the arrows directly into a fence gate and rapidly pulse the gate. This makes use of a mechanic where an arrow stuck into a block will multiply its prime motion by a random number from 0 to 0.2 once it is released from that block. Normally the distribution of arrows from a dispenser will cover the area of a square. which you can clearly see in the firing pattern of this cannon. However, when using the fence gate trick, each time we pulse the fence gate, the arrow will take a random walk weighted towards the middle of the dispenser. Meaning you get this pattern where arrows that get pulsed less end up with more of their original momentum, whilst arrows that were in the fence gate for longer get concentrated towards the middle. This gives us a neat little package of shrapnel that we can align to some precise position using gravity. Considering that we have a distribution of arrows, the distance of the TNT from those arrows will influence the final spread. So now we should have a comprehensive understanding of the dynamics of our railcannon and what parameters we can control to get the desired effects. For example, here is a prototype that uses the smallest alignment of 0.025 from the base plane. Can you predict the behavior of this cannon based upon our established dynamics? Well, being the smallest alignment, the TNT is extremely close to where the wind charge explodes. This means our TNT can turn very sharp angles and gets moved very far from the origin, which means we can shoot at very shallow angles. And the grouping at those angles is extremely tight. However, the alignment being so small also has some undesirable effects. Because the distance from the base plane is so small, tiny discrepancies in the alignment of elements become quite big, causing translation to occur in the target view angle. So tiny vertical alignments are not ideal because they amplify the inaccuracy of the cannon. Which means we're back to the drawing board, which translates to an extremely tedious process of figuring out how to get extremely specific TNT alignments. To aid with this process, I made an automated test rig which uses scoreboard values to modify the amount of TNT. It then prints out the alignment of the TNT so I can just power through a massive configuration space to gather data points. Then we can use scripting to sort through the data and find close matches. We find the best alignment puts our wind charge exactly 0.66 blocks above the base plane, with an error of 0.0112% in the TNT position. This gives us a 96-degree field of fire where the angular error is less than 0.015% for most view angles. Here is that exact alignment executed in our TNT dupers. Out of the 44 TNT used in the down acceleration stage, we subtract the T count of 27, leaving only 17 TNT remaining. And we get the TNT position exactly 0.909898, which is almost exactly 0.91. Then 0.91 is exactly 0.25 blocks above the wind charge alignment of 0.66, which we obtain using a piston pushing upwards with a slab. Logging the final explosion point of our TNT, and we find the origin of our TNT displacement is around 70.111 blocks with respect to our test setup. Subtracting the arrow anti-eye height of 0.13, and we need an arrow alignment of about 69.98 with respect to our test setup. This demanded a lot of faffing about with gravity and the motion of the arrow. But finally, using the power of mathematics, with all the elements combined, we get this. Granted, it's still not quite shooting where we're looking because the point of view for the cannon is where the TNT explodes. Which is why I got in touch with Contaria, the creator of the Anglesnap mod for Squibble's mirror receiver, who made a variation of their mod for moving the camera to specific coordinates. Using this menu, I can then set my camera to the exact position where the TNT explodes, and as you can see, it synchronizes the view angle. So now if I pop a snowball into the cannon, look at a position, bam! Pinpoint accuracy. Trying this out in the world with a bit more features. Hello, sheep. Goodbye, sheep. Creeper? Oh man. Phantoms? Be gone. The second point to keep in mind is that there is a fundamental limit to the angles that you can target entities. For example, I was able to target that sheep at a pitch of 46. I can target this sheep at an angle of 42. But at angles that are too shallow, the cannon will stop working. However, if more range is what you seek, simply build the cannon higher to make longer ranges accessible at steeper angles. So there we have it, an auto-aiming orbital rail cannon with instant kill hypersonic arrows that fire in a tight spread with pinpoint accuracy. Another weapon of mass liberation to add to our growing arsenal of Minecraft super weapons. If you want to use the cannon yourself, there are a few details to note. In the schematic, I'm going to make the origin the explosion point. So if you want to use Contaria's mod, you want to make sure that you get the coordinates of the origin, and for the Y value, give it this 0.111 offset to make sure that your camera is perfectly aligned with the explosion origin. To operate the cannon, you will want to be inside this glass control room which protects the user from misfires. To activate the cannon, you have to make sure that your player is aligned up against this ladder and this glass pane. Then you have to look straight up, throw the snowball into the aligner, and then you can look towards your target coordinates. Even without mods, you can see the cannon will simply copy the player's view angle to the origin of the cannon. So it's still technically possible to aim the cannon, but you have to simply aim off from your target by the offset between your player and the origin. This cannon is set up with command blocks so that Steve can automatically fire the cannon as we fly around and have a look. In case it isn't obvious, the cannon origin is a big no-go, as TNT explodes here with absolutely no explosion protections whatsoever. I've taken the liberty of installing note blocks to indicate when the cannon is about to fire, and when the cannon is ready to fire again. The speed of the cannon is mainly bottlenecked by a combination of the fuse time of TNT and the time it takes to dispense the arrows. The amount of arrows in each shot is controlled by this hopper clock here, which by default has 8 items in it. In this configuration, I can get Steve to fire the cannon every 8 seconds. That's a pretty decent rate of fire. When it comes to the materials for the cannon, I went with a rigorous convention of using white concrete for blocks that must be solid, regular glass for blocks that must be transparent, and white stained glass blocks for when it doesn't matter either way as long as the block is a full cube. This gives you a lot of flexibility when choosing the material list for your cannon. That wraps up pretty much everything about this new exciting cannon technology. If you want to try it out for yourself, you can find a schematic download in the description. This project was an immense amount of work. Fine-tuning each cannon prototype would take hours of tedious work, and there were many prototypes. And that's only half of it when you have to format everything into a video. If you appreciate this video and more, feel free to nail that subscribe button. I am aware that there is a lot of potential for this technology, but right now is a good place to stop for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.